They're coming after Judah's territory. They want to expand. The Jews want to expand. Everybody wants parts of this, and so there's constant fighting during this whole time. Gath is over that way, and Keilah is there, and you can see where the cave of Adullam was, and so David comes south, and then after he leaves Keilah, he heads down past Hebron to another place that I don't know how to pronounce. But David's reliance upon God is accented in each one of these stories. Twice in this story, he's told that he inquires of the Lord. He goes to Abiathar, the priest, to discern God's will. He wants to know what God has to say. All through this is emphasized. He inquired of the Lord twice during this chapter. Now, when they did this, they went to the Lord with a simple yes or no question. Should I invade this town? Should I do this? Should I do that? And they expected a simple yes and no answer. They had some strange means of determining the Lord's will that we don't use anymore regularly. They would go to the priest, and the priest had a couple of things called the Urim and the Thummim. We have no idea what those things were. But evidently, they could, throw them in the air, roll them on the ground, do whatever they were so that they could determine a simple yes and no answer from the Lord. And this was what David was doing. He is consistently and faithfully trying to find out what God wants him to do. Something that we need to do consistently and faithfully. In the meantime, Saul gets no answer. He's gone and killed all the priests. Instead of asking God what he should do from the priests, he's killing them. He's not asking any kind of answer. Saul may have the upper hand politically, but David has God's guidance. And we saw in that one story that Ben read, Saul was going around one side of the mountain and David was going around the other side of the mountain because God was on David's side and he was guiding David exactly where Saul was not going to be. And so he escapes from this city. Saul thinks he has him trapped inside this town. He thinks he has him bottled up. It'd be easier to kill him if he knew he was where he was. But David has inquired of the Lord, and he is going to escape. He fears that what happened at Nob is going to happen here at Keilah as well. And he thinks that Saul will come down here and destroy the town on account of me. Saul has just gone off the deep end, and he's willing to kill lots of people just to get at David. Saul is mustering his troops to capture David, and rather than going after the Philistines. David has just won for him a battle. But Saul, instead of pursuing the advantage that he had after this battle, wants to get David. He has lost track of what he was supposed to do as king. And so his men escape into the desert of Ziph, which is down there south of Keilah. And it says that God did not give David into his hands. God is protecting David. God is the king in this situation. Who has the real power? God does. And he's going to get his will done. Down in the wilderness of Ziph, Jonathan meets him, I think for the last time. And he reassures David. They have gone out from Ziph to Horish, and then now they're going to go out into to Maon, wherever that is. And Jonathan helped him find strength in God. God does this. One of the ways that God helps us encourages us when we're being bounced around, in the pinball machine, is that he gives us people who will encourage us. Jonathan once again says, you're going to be king. This time he says, I'm going to be second in command, and that's just fine with me. He encourages him, saying, God has promised you. You can rely on these promises. They may not be being fulfilled the way you think they are, but God has promised you. And so Saul starts to pursue David even further south. And they go down to this town of Maon, or I don't know how to pronounce that one either. Here, let's go. All right, first he goes to Gath, then he goes to Adullam, then he goes down to the desert someplace, and then he goes back up to Keilah, and then he goes down to Ziph, and now he's going down to Man, and now who knows, he's just being bounced around. But in each step, he is asking God what's happening. God continues to protect David from the hand of Saul. And the irony here, again, is the role of the Philistines. In this last story, the Philistines actually saved David. Saul finally hears that the Philistines are attacking, and he runs off, finally doing his job as God protects David. He feels that he has to go after this Philistine raid, and God is protecting David. Now, Saul has been pathetically relying on his reconnaissance, on spies, on all of the earthly things that he can think of to try and get David. But David is relying upon the Lord. Saul even thinks that God has handed him over to me. Here is a man who is so blind to what God wants that he is doing exactly the opposite of what God wants and calling it God's will. He has no clue what God is saying. He has to rely on his own skill and doesn't listen to God at all. And the Philistines are wreaking havoc all over the place because he doesn't listen to the Lord. By contrast, David is inflicting losses on the Philistines, and David is being protected, and he is being protected because he is going to the Lord through the priest Abiathar. We have some applications. If you haven't figured out some of the applications yet, I don't know what you've been listening to. One of them is you need to listen to what God has to say. Part of this is that God will tell certain things and he will prophesy certain events, and God's words will always come true. But they may not come true in the ways that we think they would. David meets Ahimelech in 21. And then all of those people are killed. Now that is in response to a prophecy that we found back in chapter 2, where Eli and his sons were so evil that God said, I am going to cut them off as far as being priests in Israel. But even here, one of them escapes. So is God's prophecy fulfilled? Partially, yes. But it waits full fulfillment in 1 Kings chapter 2 when Solomon replaces Abiathar with Zadok. Abiathar finally does something. David is dying. Abiathar sides with the wrong son. He is not listening to God at that point. And Abiathar is replaced by Zadok. And then God's final fulfillment is taken place. God is indeed king of Israel, and he's faithful to what he prophesies. Now, but in prophesying, there are three things that happen. There are some near fulfillments. There are some subsequent fulfillments to prophecies. And sometimes there are far fulfillments. And we have to ask ourselves what's going on. In this story, Eli, Hophni, and Phinehas die as a very near fulfillment. God says, I am going to cut off the family of Eli because they are evil, and they die.